Billionaire was ready to enjoy Christmas vacation, until a call said his ex was alone with sick baby. Welcome to Secrets Narrated. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with twists and hidden truths, make sure to follow Secrets Narrated so you don't miss the next one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy every detail. Elliot Van Doren adjusted his Armani cufflinks as he reviewed the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk. At 44, he had mastered the art of compartmentalizing his life into neat, manageable sections. Work occupied the largest compartment. His tech logistics empire demanded nothing less than perfection. Personal relationships, however, had been relegated to the smallest corner of his existence, locked away where they couldn't interfere with his carefully constructed routine. The December morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse office, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Christmas was 5 days away, and Elliot had already finalized his vacation plans. A week in Aspen skiing alone, followed by New Year's in his Malibu beach house. No complications, no expectations, no disappointments. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Van Doren, your car will be ready in an hour for the airport." "Thank you, Rebecca." He signed the last document without looking up. "Make sure the Aspen house is fully stocked. I don't want to see another soul for the next 2 weeks." Rebecca hesitated at the doorway. "Sir, what if there's an emergency?" Elliot's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There won't be." As she closed the door, Elliot allowed himself a moment to stare out at the bustling city below. 2 years. It had been exactly 2 years since he'd made the most cowardly decision of his life, walking away from Sienna Clark when she was 4 months pregnant with his child. The memory surfaced unbidden. Sienna's tear-stained face the last time they'd spoken, her hand instinctively protective over her small but visible bump. He'd convinced himself that leaving was the right choice. He wasn't ready to be a father. Hell, he wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. His own father had been a distant, cold man who viewed children as business investments rather than human beings. Elliot refused to put another child through that kind of emotional neglect. But as the months passed, he realized his noble intentions were just sophisticated excuses for his own fear. He knew the baby had been born. Theo Van Doren Clark, born on a rainy Tuesday in April, weighing 6 pounds, 11 ounces, now 1 year and 8 months old. Elliot's private investigator had provided the basic information, not because Elliot had asked for surveillance, but because he'd needed to ensure child support payments were being processed correctly through his attorneys. Sienna had never asked for money beyond the court-mandated support. She'd never called, never sent photos, never tried to guilt him into involvement. Her silence was both a relief and a torment. Elliot had almost called several times. Birthdays, holidays, random Tuesday afternoons when the weight of his absence felt unbearable. But each time he'd convinced himself that reaching out would only complicate things. Theo was better off without a father who might disappoint him. His phone buzzed with a text from his pilot confirming their departure time. Elliot gathered his travel documents, shoving thoughts of Sienna and Theo back into their designated compartment. This Christmas would be like the last two, quiet, solitary, and free from the emotional messiness that had once defined his life. As he reached for his briefcase, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost declined the call, probably another business associate trying to reach him before his vacation. But something made him answer. Elliot Van Doren speaking. "Mr. Van Doren?" The voice was female, professional, tinged with the controlled urgency he recognized from his own high-pressure business world. "This is Nurse Patricia Williams from Mount Sinai Hospital. Do you know Sienna Clark?" The air seemed to leave Elliot's lungs. His knees felt suddenly weak and he gripped the edge of his desk for support. "Yes. What's wrong?" "Ms. Clark brought her son to our emergency department early this morning. The child is running a high fever and having difficulty breathing. She asked me to call you." The words hit him like a physical blow. Theo was sick. Sienna was alone at the hospital with a sick child, their child, and she had given his number as an emergency contact. "Is he?" Elliot's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Is the baby going to be okay?" "The doctors are examining him now. It appears to be a respiratory infection, but we'll know more soon. Miss Clark seemed quite exhausted, and she mentioned she didn't have anyone else to call." "No one else to call?" The phrase echoed in Elliot's mind. For the past 20 months, Sienna had been raising their son completely alone, while Elliot had been playing the role of successful bachelor, pretending his heart hadn't been shattered the day he walked away from the only woman he'd ever truly loved. Which hospital? His hands were already moving toward his car keys. Mount Sinai, Emergency Department. Room 247. Elliot was already heading toward the door when he realized his assistant was staring at him with concern. Cancel everything, he told Rebecca. Cancel Aspen. Cancel the meetings next week. Cancel everything. As he rushed toward the elevator, one thought pounded through his mind with devastating clarity. For 2 years he'd been running from the most important responsibility of his life, and now his son needed him. The 20-minute drive to Mount Sinai felt like an eternity. Elliot's hands gripped the steering wheel of his Tesla so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Traffic moved at a maddeningly slow pace, and every red light felt like a personal insult from the universe. He tried to prepare himself for what he would find at the hospital, but his mind kept circling back to the same devastating realization. He had never even seen his son's face in person. The only glimpses he'd caught were accidental. A blurry photo in the background of Sienna's LinkedIn profile update 6 months ago, and once, when he'd driven past the small park near her apartment building and seen a woman with familiar auburn hair pushing a toddler on a swing. He'd sped away before he could confirm it was them. Now, as he navigated through midtown traffic, those moments of cowardice felt like lead weights in his chest. What kind of man abandons his own child? What kind of father chooses his own comfort over his son's well-being? His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Private jet crew asks if they should wait. Elliot didn't even respond. Aspen seemed like a lifetime ago, a frivolous escape plan from a man who no longer existed. When he finally reached the hospital parking garage, Elliot sat in his car for a full minute, staring at the concrete wall in front of him. His expensive wool coat suddenly felt suffocating. His hands were trembling, actually trembling, like he was some nervous teenager instead of a man who'd built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. The elevator ride to the second floor was torture. A young couple stood beside him, the woman heavily pregnant, the man's arm protectively wrapped around her waist. They looked tired but happy, discussing baby names in hushed, excited voices. Elliot wanted to tell them to cherish this moment, to never take it for granted, to never let fear make their decisions for them. Room 247 was at the end of a long corridor that smelled of disinfectant and anxiety. Through the small window in the door, Elliot could see her. Sienna. She looked exactly the same, yet completely different. Her auburn hair was longer now, pulled back in a messy bun that suggested she'd been up all night. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, both wrinkled from hours of worry. But what struck him most was the look of absolute exhaustion on her face. Not just physical tiredness, but the bone-deep weariness that came from carrying the world alone for too long. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Theo, Elliot's son. The child was clearly unwell. His face was flushed with fever, and even through the glass, Elliot could see the rapid rise and fall of his tiny chest. Theo's hair was dark like Elliot's, but he had Sienna's delicate features. Even sick and sleeping, he was beautiful. Elliot knocked softly before entering. Sienna looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met across 20 months of silence and regret. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. There was no anger in her tone, no accusation, just a simple acknowledgement of his presence, as if he'd been gone for 20 minutes instead of 20 months. "How is he?" Elliot kept his voice low, not wanting to disturb the sleeping child. "The doctor thinks it's bronchiolitis, a viral infection. His oxygen levels are okay, but his fever spiked to 103 this morning." Sienna shifted Theo gently in her arms. "They want to keep him for observation, maybe overnight." Elliot moved closer, close enough to see the delicate curve of Theo's eyelashes, the way his tiny fist was curled against Sienna's sweater. His son. This perfect, vulnerable little person was half him, and he'd missed every single day of his life so far. "I was getting ready to leave for Aspen when the hospital called," Elliot said, then immediately regretted how selfish that sounded. Sienna nodded without judgment. "I know it's Christmas week. I wouldn't have given them your number, but—" She trailed off, her voice catching slightly. "I've been dealing with this alone for 8 hours. He wouldn't stop crying, and his breathing was so labored I got scared." The admission hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. Sienna Clark didn't get scared easily. In the 3 years they'd been together, He'd seen her handle crisis after crisis with calm determination. She was the woman who'd talked him through his worst business disasters, who'd held him together when his own father had died. If she was scared enough to call him, she must have been terrified. "You should have called me sooner," Elliot said, then immediately realized how that sounded. "I mean, you should never have had to handle this alone." Sienna looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "You made it clear you weren't ready to be a father, Elliot. I respected that choice." "That wasn't respect, Sienna. That was you being strong enough to handle what I was too weak to face." Before she could respond, Theo stirred in her arms. His eyes fluttered open, the same gray-green eyes that Elliot saw in the mirror every morning. For a moment the child looked directly at him with the unfocused curiosity of a sick toddler. "Dada?" Theo whispered in a small, congested voice. Elliot's heart stopped. Sienna's face went carefully blank. "He's been saying that word for months," she explained quietly. "He sees other children at daycare with their fathers. I never told him anything about you, but he knows the word." Theo reached one tiny hand toward Elliot, and without thinking, Elliot extended his finger. The child's grip was surprisingly strong, surprisingly warm. In that moment, sitting in a sterile hospital room with his sick son's tiny hand wrapped around his finger, Elliot understood with crystalline clarity that every single day he'd stayed away had been a betrayal, not just of Sienna, but of this innocent child who deserved better. A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Van Doren? The doctor would like to speak with both parents about Theo's treatment plan." Dr. Amanda Reeves was the kind of pediatrician who could deliver devastating news with gentle authority and somehow make parents feel both informed and comforted. She gestured for Elliot and Sienna to sit in the small consultation room adjacent to Theo's hospital room, while a nurse stayed with the sleeping toddler. "First, let me reassure you that Theo is going to be fine." "Dr. Dio," Reeves began, pulling up his chest x-rays on her tablet. "He has bronchiolitis, which is common in children his age, especially during winter months. The inflammation in his airways is causing the difficulty breathing and fever." Elliot found himself leaning forward, studying the black and white images as if he could somehow decode them himself. He realized with a start that he had no idea what a normal toddler's medical history should look like. Had Theo been sick before? Did he have allergies? Was he up to date on vaccinations? The good news is that his oxygen saturation is stable, and he's responding well to the nebulizer treatments. Dr. Reeves continued. "We'll want to keep him overnight for monitoring, but I expect him to be much better by tomorrow afternoon." "How long will he be contagious?" Sienna asked, her voice still hoarse from exhaustion. "Another day or two. You'll want to keep him home from daycare until his fever breaks and stays gone for 24 hours. Dr. Reeves paused, glancing between them. "I assume one of you can stay home with him?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sienna's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that Elliot remembered from their relationship. She was calculating whether she could afford to miss more work, whether her small marketing consulting business could survive another unpaid sick day. "I can stay with him," Elliot said quietly. Both women stared at him in surprise. Sienna's eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Elliot, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firmer this time. "I should have been there for all of this. The least I can do is be here now." Dr. Reeves tactfully shifted back to medical matters. "Ms. Clark, you mentioned Theo had a slight cough last week. Has he been exposed to anyone who was sick?" As Sienna answered the doctor's questions, Elliot found himself studying her face, noting the subtle changes that 20 months had carved there. There were faint lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worry. Her hands, which had once been soft from her office job, now showed the subtle wear of someone who'd been doing everything herself: cooking, cleaning, caring, providing. "Mr. Van Doren?" Dr. Reeves was looking at him expectantly. "I'm sorry, what?" "I was asking about family medical history. Any respiratory issues, allergies, or chronic conditions we should be aware of?" Elliot felt heat rise in his face. Another basic piece of his son's life that he should know but didn't. "No major issues in my family. My father had high blood pressure, but that was later in life." Dr. Reeves made notes on her tablet. "And Ms. Clark has already provided Theo's complete medical history. He's been remarkably healthy, just the usual minor colds and one bout with an ear infection at 14 months. An ear infection that Elliot had known nothing about. A sick child that Sienna had comforted alone while Elliot was probably in some business meeting, oblivious to his son's suffering. "Are there any questions about his care going forward?" Dr. Reeves asked. Sienna started to shake her head, then hesitated. "Actually, yes. Theo's been having trouble sleeping lately, even before he got sick. He wakes up crying almost every night and I can't figure out why. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. Night terrors are common at his age, especially during times of change or stress. Has anything significant changed in his routine recently? Sienna glanced at Elliot and he caught something in her expression, a flicker of guilt that made his stomach clench. We had to move apartments last month, she said carefully. The rent on our old place was raised and we had to find somewhere more affordable. The words hit Elliot like a physical blow. While he'd been living in his Manhattan penthouse, worrying about which vacation home to visit for Christmas, Sienna had been forced to move because she couldn't afford rent. His son had been uprooted from his home, thrust into unfamiliar surroundings, all while Elliot had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. Moving can definitely disrupt a toddler's sleep patterns, Dr. Reeves said kindly. Try to keep his bedtime routine as consistent as possible. Reading stories, soft music, maybe a nightlight if the new room feels too different. I'll make sure he has everything he needs, Elliot said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Sienna shot him a sharp look. Elliot, we should probably get back to Theo, he interrupted, not wanting to have this conversation in front of the doctor. Dr. Reeves stood, gathering her tablet. I'll check on him again in a few hours. Try to get some rest, both of you. Sick children recover faster when their parents aren't running on empty. As they walked back toward Theo's room, Sienna caught Elliot's arm. We need to talk, she said quietly. But not here. Not now. Through the doorway, they could see Theo stirring restlessly in the hospital crib, his small face still flushed with fever. The nurse was adjusting his IV line while he whimpered softly in his sleep. He looks so small, Elliot whispered, more to himself than to Sienna. He is small. He's 20 months old, Elliot. He's barely more than a baby. Sienna's voice carried a weight of exhaustion that went far beyond one sleepless night in a hospital. And for the past year and 8 months, every time he's been sick, scared, or hurt, I've been the only one here. The accusation in her words was gentle, but unmistakable. Elliot nodded, accepting it. I know. And I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't fix anything. He paused, watching as Theo's breathing gradually became more even, the medication finally taking effect. But I'm here now, and I want to be here tomorrow, and the day after that. Sienna studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether his words were genuine or just another beautifully crafted business promise. Being a parent isn't a temporary assignment, Elliot. You can't just show up when it's convenient and disappear when it gets hard. Before he could respond, Theo's eyes opened. The toddler looked around the unfamiliar room with confusion, then focused on Elliot's face. For a moment, neither father nor son moved. Then Theo lifted his tiny arms toward Elliot and said with heartbreaking clarity, Up, Daddy, up. The world seemed to stop. Theo's small voice echoing, Daddy, up, hung in the air like a prayer, and an accusation wrapped into one. Elliot stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared down at his son, this tiny person who somehow recognized him despite never having been held by him. Sienna's face had gone pale. She looked between Elliot and Theo with an expression that mixed shock, pain, and something that might have been resignation. He doesn't understand what he's saying, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Elliot took a tentative step closer to the hospital crib. Theo's arms remained outstretched, his gray-green eyes fixed on his father's face with the absolute trust that only children possess. The toddler's breathing was still labored from his illness, but his gaze was alert, hopeful. Can I? Elliot looked to Sienna for permission. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded almost imperceptibly. With movements that felt simultaneously clumsy and reverent, Elliot reached down and carefully lifted his son from the crib. Theo was lighter than he'd expected, but also more solid. A real, warm, living person who smelled like hospital soap, and that indefinable sweetness that belonged only to children. The moment Theo settled against Elliot's chest, something fundamental shifted in the universe. This wasn't just holding a child. This was holding his child. The child he'd helped create, whose heartbeat he'd heard in utero, whose existence he'd run from in terror. Theo immediately curled into him, his small head finding the hollow of Elliot's shoulder as if he'd been designed to fit there. One tiny hand fisted in Elliot's expensive shirt, while the other clutched a small stuffed elephant that looked well-loved and slightly worn. He's so warm, Elliot murmured, feeling the fever radiating through Theo's small body. The medication should bring his temperature down soon, Sienna said softly. but she was watching them both with an unreadable expression. Elliot found himself swaying slightly, an instinctive rocking motion that seemed to soothe Theo. The toddler's breathing gradually became less labored, his body relaxing against his father's chest. "What's his favorite thing to do?" Elliot asked suddenly. The question felt both urgent and pathetic. A father who should know his own child's preferences asking for basic information. Sienna was quiet for so long that Elliot thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "He loves books. We read every night before bed, sometimes the same story 4 or 5 times in a row." She paused. "He likes to help me cook, which mostly means making a mess with measuring cups. He's obsessed with trucks and buses. Every time we hear a garbage truck outside, he runs to the window and waves." Each detail felt like a small gift and a devastating loss. 20 months of favorite books, cooking disasters, and garbage truck encounters that Elliot had missed completely. Does he ask about me?" The question slipped out before Elliot could stop it. Sienna's expression tightened. "He asks about daddies sometimes, when he sees other children at the park with their fathers. I tell him that families come in different shapes, that some children have mommies and daddies, some have just mommies or just daddies, and some have grandparents or other people who love them." "That's a good answer," Elliot said, though the words felt inadequate. "It's an honest answer," Sienna corrected. "I never lied to him about you, Elliot. I didn't know what truth to tell him." Theo stirred in Elliot's arms, making a small, contented sound. He looked up at his father with those familiar gray-green eyes and smiled, a real smile that transformed his fever-flushed face into something luminous. The smile hit Elliot like a physical force. This was his son. This perfect, trusting, beautiful child was his son, and he'd voluntarily missed every single milestone of his young life. First steps, first words, first teeth, first everything. "I need to know," Elliot said quietly, still swaying with Theo in his arms. "I need to know everything. When he started walking, what his first word was, how he likes his food cut, what makes him laugh. I need to know all of it." Sienna studied his face for a long moment. "His first word was mama," she said finally. "He started walking at 13 months. Early, the doctor said. He won't eat anything green unless it's hidden in something else. He laughs when I make silly voices for his stuffed animals." She paused. "And every night after we read stories, he looks at the ceiling and babbles to himself for about 10 minutes before he falls asleep. I call it his dream planning." Elliot found himself smiling despite the ache in his chest. Dream planning. He's an incredible little person, Elliot. Smart, funny, affectionate, but he's also been through a lot of changes lately. Sienna's voice grew more serious. The move was hard on him. "Our new apartment is smaller, louder. The neighbors upstairs have 3 kids and apparently never sleep. He's been clingy, having those nightmares the doctor mentioned." The guilt was suffocating. While Elliot had been accumulating wealth and accolades, his son had been struggling with upheaval and insecurity. "Where are you living now?" Elliot asked. "Queens, Woodside. It's fine. The commute to my office is longer, but the neighborhood is family-friendly." Sienna's tone was determinedly positive, but Elliot could hear the exhaustion underneath. "How long was the lease on your old place?" Sienna frowned. "Why does that matter?" "How long, Sienna?" 2 more years, she admitted reluctantly. "But when they raised the rent by 40%, I couldn't. I had to make a choice between financial stability and staying in a place Theo loved. 40%. Elliot's monthly wine budget was probably more than Sienna's rent had been. "I could have helped," he said quietly. "You made it clear you didn't want to be involved." Sienna's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. "I wasn't going to come begging for help from someone who walked away when things got complicated." Theo shifted in Elliot's arms, pressing his face against his father's neck. The trust in that simple gesture was overwhelming. "Dada," Theo whispered sleepily. "Stay." Elliot closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of 2 years' worth of wrong choices pressing down on him. When he opened them again, Sienna was watching them both with an expression he couldn't quite read. "He's never going to forgive me for missing so much," Elliot said. "He's 20 months old," Sienna replied softly. "He doesn't understand forgiveness yet, but he understands presence." A nurse appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Visiting hours are ending in 15 minutes, she said gently. "But parents are welcome to stay overnight if you'd like." Elliot looked at Sienna, then down at Theo, who had fallen asleep against his chest. The decision should have been complicated, but it wasn't. "I'm staying," he said. Sienna's eyebrows rose in surprise. Elliot, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I've missed every night of his life so far. I'm not missing this one. The hospital at night was a different creature entirely. The bustling energy of daytime had given way to hushed conversations, the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle shuffle of night shift nurses making their rounds. Elliot sat in the uncomfortable reclining chair beside Theo's crib, watching his son sleep while Sienna dozed fitfully in the narrow hospital bed they'd moved into the room. Theo had woken twice in the past 4 hours, once crying from a fever spike that had the nurses rushing in with cooling blankets, and once simply reaching for his father with sleepy arms. Each time Elliot had been there, learning the weight of his son's body, the particular way Theo liked to be held when he was uncomfortable, the soft humming sound that seemed to soothe him back to sleep. You're still awake. Sienna's voice came softly from the bed. Elliot turned to see her watching him in the dim light from the hallway. She'd changed into scrubs that the hospital had provided, practical cotton that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the composed woman who'd been handling everything alone for 20 months. I don't want to miss anything else, Elliot said quietly, turning back to watch Theo's steady breathing. Sienna was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Do you remember the night we found out I was pregnant? Elliot's hand tightened on the arm of the chair. Of course he remembered. They'd been in Sienna's small apartment, the one she'd loved, the one she'd had to leave because he'd abandoned them. She'd taken 3 different pregnancy tests, each one confirming what they both already knew. You cried, he said softly. We both cried, Sienna corrected, but for different reasons. Elliot closed his eyes, letting himself remember that night fully for the first time in 2 years. Sienna's tears had been complex, fear mixed with wonder, uncertainty tempered by a fierce protectiveness that had surprised them both. His own tears had been pure terror. I was so scared, he admitted. Not of you, not of the baby exactly. I was scared of becoming my father. Sienna shifted in the hospital bed, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him more clearly. Your father was a difficult man, but he wasn't a monster, Elliot. You were never going to be him. Wasn't I? Elliot's voice was barely above a whisper. He was absent even when he was physically present. He treated love like a business transaction, conditional, performance-based. When things got difficult, he withdrew. When I got scared about being a father, what did I do? The question hung between them like an indictment. You left, Sienna said simply. But you also made sure we were financially provided for. You didn't disappear completely. Money isn't present, Sienna. Money isn't showing up at 3 in the morning when he's sick. Money isn't teaching him to tie his shoes or reading him bedtime stories. Elliot looked at his sleeping son. Money is the easy part. Sienna was quiet for several minutes, and Elliot thought she might have fallen back asleep. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more reflective. The day I brought Theo home from the hospital, I sat in our apartment, my apartment, for 6 hours just staring at him. This tiny person who was completely dependent on me for everything. I kept thinking you were going to walk through the door, that you'd changed your mind, that you'd realized we could figure it out together. The words hit Elliot like physical blows. Sienna. I waited for 3 months, she continued, her voice still calm but carrying an undercurrent of pain that had been carefully buried. Every time the phone rang, every time someone knocked on the door, every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I kept thinking you were coming back. Elliot wanted to interrupt, to explain, to defend his choices, but he forced himself to listen. This was her truth, and he owed her that much. When did you stop waiting? He asked. Theo's first Christmas. He was 8 months old, just starting to crawl, fascinated by the lights on the tree. I realized I was spending more time watching the door than watching him discover the world. That's when I knew I had to stop hoping for you and start building a life for us. The image of Sienna alone with baby Theo at Christmas, waiting for a father who never came, was almost unbearable. I thought about calling so many times, Elliot said. I had your number saved under Do Not Call in my phone. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid if I heard your voice, if I heard him crying in the background, I'd lose my resolve. What resolve? Sienna's voice had an edge now. The resolve to abandon your child? The resolve to stay away because I was convinced he was better off without me. Elliot ran his hands through his hair. I know how that sounds now. I know how selfish and cowardly it was. But at the time I genuinely believed that a father who wasn't ready was worse than no father at all. Sienna sat up fully now, her legs curled beneath her on the narrow bed. Do you want to know something? Theo used to cry every night between 6 and 7 p.m. The pediatrician said it was colic, but I think it was something else. That was the time you used to come home from work when we were together. The time we used to make dinner together, talk about our days. I think somehow, even as a baby, he knew something was missing from that routine. The revelation felt like a knife twisting in Elliot's chest. His absence had affected Theo even as an infant, in ways he'd never imagined. "How do I fix this?" Elliot asked. "How do I make up for 20 months of not being here?" Sienna was quiet for a long time, studying his face in the dim light. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "You don't make up for it, Elliot. That time is gone. Those moments, those milestones, those nights when I needed help and had no one to call. You can't get them back and you can't erase them." She paused, glancing at their sleeping son. "But you can be here for what comes next." "What does that mean?" "Practically, I mean. It means showing up. Not just when it's convenient, not just when he's sick and I'm desperate enough to call you. It means being present for the boring Tuesday afternoons, the grocery store meltdowns, the bedtime stories, the thousands of tiny moments that make up a childhood." Elliot nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was describing. "I want that. I want all of it." "Wanting it and doing it are different things," Sienna said gently. "You've built a life that's very different from this. Private jets, exotic vacations, business deals that span continents. Being a parent means staying home when everyone else goes out, missing important meetings because your child has a fever, choosing family over career advancement sometimes." She was right, and they both knew it. Elliot's life had been carefully constructed to avoid exactly the kind of unpredictable, emotionally demanding situation he now found himself in. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Reeves peered in, tablet in hand. "How's our patient doing?" she asked quietly. "Better," Elliot said, surprised by how naturally the word "our" had registered. "His breathing seems easier." Dr. Reeves approached the crib and checked Theo's vitals without waking him. "Much improved. If he continues like this through the morning, you should be able to take him home after lunch." Home. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with questions neither of them was ready to ask. The discharge from the hospital took longer than expected. Theo's fever had broken completely, but the paperwork, medication instructions, and follow-up appointment scheduling stretched well into the afternoon. By the time they were loading a much more alert and cheerful Theo into Elliot's Tesla, the winter sun was already beginning its descent toward the Manhattan skyline. Theo was fascinated by the car. He pressed his small palms against the leather seats, babbled excitedly at the digital dashboard, and kept pointing out the window at passing buses while shouting, "Bus, big bus," with the enthusiasm only a toddler could muster. Watching his son discover the world with such pure joy was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. 20 months of wonder that Elliot had missed completely. "Turn left at the next light," Sienna directed from the passenger seat, her voice carefully neutral. They'd been mostly quiet during the drive from Manhattan to Queens, the weight of their hospital conversation still hanging between them. But as they entered Woodside, Elliot began to understand exactly what Sienna's forced move had meant. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it was a far cry from the tree-lined streets of her old apartment in Park Slope. Here, the buildings were closer together, older, with less green space and more concrete. The sounds were different too. More traffic, more sirens, more of the urban chaos that never quite stopped. "It's the red brick building on the right," Sienna said quietly. Elliot pulled up to a 4-story walk-up that looked like it had seen better decades. The front steps were cracked. There was graffiti on the mailboxes, and he could hear music thumping from an upstairs window, even with the car windows closed. "Mama home," Theo announced happily, clapping his hands. Sienna smiled at their son's enthusiasm, but Elliot caught the slight tightening around her eyes. This wasn't the home she'd wanted for Theo, and they both knew it. Getting Theo and his medical supplies up to the 3rd floor was an adventure. The elevator was broken, again according to Sienna's resigned explanation, so they had to navigate narrow stairs while Theo insisted on helping by carrying his stuffed elephant and pointing out every interesting detail along the way. "Dog," he announced as they passed the 2nd floor, where barking echoed from behind a door. "Big dog." "That's Rex," Sienna explained to Elliot. "He barks at everything. Mrs. Patterson got him after her husband died, and I think she's going a little deaf, so she doesn't realize how loud he is." When they reached the 3rd floor, Sienna fumbled with multiple locks before opening the door to their apartment. Elliot tried to keep his expression neutral, but the contrast with her previous home was stark. The apartment was tiny. The living room, kitchen, and dining area were all one small space, with a narrow hallway leading to what he assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. The ceilings were low, the windows small, and despite Sienna's obvious efforts to make it cheerful with bright throw pillows and Theo's colorful toys, it felt cramped and dark. "Sorry about the mess," Sienna said, though the apartment was actually quite tidy. "We're still settling in." Theo immediately ran to a corner where his toys were organized in plastic bins, pulling out a set of wooden blocks and beginning to build an elaborate tower that would inevitably fall down within minutes. Elliot walked slowly through the space, taking in the details that told the story of their life together. Theo's high chair squeezed into the tiny kitchen. A laundry basket doubled as a toy chest. Books stacked everywhere because there wasn't enough shelf space. The small table that served as both dining surface and Sienna's work desk. Her laptop pushed to one side to make room for Theo's lunch. "This is his room," Sienna said, opening a door to reveal a space barely large enough for a toddler bed, a small dresser, and nothing else. "It's not much, but he likes the trains on the curtains." Elliot stared at the cheerful train-patterned curtains that Sienna had obviously hung, to make the windowless room feel less claustrophobic. His son's entire world fit into a space smaller than Elliot's walk-in closet. "The neighbors upstairs have 3 kids, Sienna continued as if on cue. The sound of running footsteps and shouting filtered down from above. "They're actually really nice, but the sound carries, especially at night." From the living room, they heard a crash as Theo's block tower met its inevitable fate, followed by delighted giggling. "He's happy here," Sienna said, though her voice carried a defensive note that suggested she'd had to convince herself of that fact. "Are you?" Elliot asked quietly. Sienna's shoulders tensed. "We're managing. The rent is affordable, it's safe enough, and there's a good daycare 6 blocks away." Theo's adjusted better than I expected. That wasn't what he'd asked, and they both knew it. "Sienna, your old apartment is gone, Elliot. The lease was transferred to new tenants the day after we moved out." Her voice was firm, final. "We can't go backward." Theo appeared in the doorway, having apparently lost interest in his blocks. He walked directly to Elliot and held up his arms with the confident expectation of a child who had never been refused. "Up, Daddy, see room?" Elliot lifted him and Theo immediately began a toddler-paced tour, pointing out his bed. Mine bed, his stuffed animals, bear, elephant, doggy, and the train curtains. Choo-choo. His enthusiasm for his small space was infectious and heartbreaking in equal measure. "The bathroom's through here," Sienna said, opening another door to reveal a space so small that Elliot would have to duck to use the shower. "And this is my room." Her bedroom was even smaller than Theo's, with just enough space for a double bed, a small dresser, and a chair that was clearly serving as both seating and closet overflow. Clothes were neatly folded in stacks because there wasn't enough hanging space. Her jewelry, what little of it remained, was organized in a small dish on the windowsill. "Where do you work?" Elliot asked, noticing the laptop but no designated workspace. "Kitchen table during the day when Theo's at daycare. Living room floor after he goes to bed." Sienna's tone was matter-of-fact, but Elliot could see the toll this arrangement was taking. Her consulting business required client calls, video conferences, focused work time, none of which were easily accomplished in this cramped space with a toddler and noisy neighbors. As if summoned by their conversation, a baby began crying somewhere upstairs, followed by what sounded like a domestic argument in rapid Spanish. Theo, still in Elliot's arms, pointed toward the ceiling. "Baby sad," he observed with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child. "Sometimes the babies upstairs get sad," Sienna explained gently, "but their mommies and daddies take care of them, just like we take care of you." The casual inclusion of "we" in that sentence hit Elliot like a physical force. For 20 months there had been no "we." There had been Sienna, alone, managing everything from midnight fevers to rent increases to the 1,000 daily challenges of raising a toddler in a world that wasn't designed for single mothers. "I need to give him his medication," Sienna said, taking Theo from Elliot's arms. "The doctor wants him to finish the full course even though he's feeling better." As she prepared the liquid antibiotic with practiced efficiency, measuring the dose, mixing it with a small amount of apple juice to make it more palatable, Elliot realized he was watching a routine that had been perfected over months of solo parenting. Every movement was economical, every decision based on hard-won experience. Theo took his medicine without complaint, then immediately ran back to his toys, his brief illness apparently forgotten in the way that only young children could manage. "He bounces back quickly," Elliot observed. "He has to," Sienna said quietly. When you're doing it alone, you learn that resilience isn't optional. The simple statement contained multitudes. Sick days when Sienna had no backup, sleepless nights with no one to share the burden, decisions made in isolation because there was no partner to consult. I could help, Elliot said. I want to help, not just financially. Elliot. Sienna's voice was gentle but firm. You can't just show up and fix everything with money and good intentions. This is our life, our real, day-to-day, unglamorous life. It's not a problem that needs solving. It's a family that needs stability. Before he could respond, Theo ran over to them, a children's book clutched in his small hands. Story time, he announced, looking expectantly between his parents. Daddy read? The hope in his voice was unmistakable. For the first time in his young life, he had both his parents in the same room, and he wanted the most normal thing in the world, a bedtime story read by his father. Elliot looked at Sienna, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Of course, Elliot said, settling onto the small couch as Theo climbed into his lap. What story should we read? As Theo opened the well-worn book, a tale about a little bear learning to be brave, Elliot realized that this moment, cramped apartment and all, was the most important meeting of his entire career. Reading to Theo was unlike anything Elliot had ever experienced. The toddler settled against his chest with complete trust, occasionally pointing at pictures and offering commentary in his developing vocabulary. Bear scared, he observed, when the little bear in the story faced a dark forest. Daddy here, he added, patting Elliot's arm as if to reassure both the fictional bear and himself. They read the same story 3 times because Theo kept saying, again, with such enthusiasm that Elliot couldn't refuse. By the 3rd reading, he'd memorized the simple text, but watching his son's face light up at each familiar turn in the plot never got old. He likes routine, Sienna explained softly from the kitchen, where she was preparing Theo's dinner. Same stories, same bedtime rituals. It helps him feel secure. Security. The word hit Elliot with uncomfortable force. What did security mean to a 20-month-old? Certainly not a trust fund or stock portfolios. It meant knowing that bedtime would include stories, that dinner would appear at the same time each day, that when he woke up scared in the night, the same person would come to comfort him. Hungry, Theo announced, sliding off Elliot's lap and running toward the kitchen with the casual expectation that food would be waiting for him. Perfect timing, Sienna said, lifting him into his high chair. She'd prepared what looked like a carefully balanced toddler meal, cut-up chicken, steamed vegetables, and small pieces of bread arranged to look like a smiley face on his plate. He won't eat the broccoli unless it's hiding under the chicken, she warned Elliot, and he likes to feed himself even though it gets messy. Watching Theo eat was both entertaining and enlightening. He chattered constantly between bites, offering food to his stuffed elephant and methodically sorted his vegetables before grudgingly eating a few pieces. When he dropped chicken on the floor, he looked immediately to Sienna with an expression that was part apology, part test to see if he was in trouble. Accidents happen, she said mildly, cleaning up the mess without drama. Accents, Theo repeated solemnly, then immediately dropped another piece to see if the rule was consistent. Nice try, buddy, Sienna said with a smile, but that one was on purpose. The easy rhythm between mother and son spoke of months of shared meals, established boundaries, and patient teaching. Elliot found himself wondering how many dinners they'd shared at this small table, how many messes Sienna had cleaned up alone, how many times she'd sung the silly song she was humming now to keep Theo entertained while he ate. He's a good eater, Elliot observed. Most days. Last week he decided he would only eat foods that were yellow. That was an interesting challenge. Sienna wiped Theo's hands and face with practiced efficiency. Kids go through phases. You learn to adapt. Another reminder of all the phases Elliot had missed. The picky eating stages, the developmental leaps, the small victories and daily challenges that made up the reality of parenting. Bath time, Theo announced, apparently following some internal schedule that Elliot was just beginning to understand. The bathroom was so small that only one adult could fit comfortably while Theo was in the tub. Elliot found himself standing in the doorway, watching Sienna orchestrate bath time with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times alone. She had toys strategically placed, towels within easy reach, and somehow managed to keep Theo entertained while actually getting him clean. Daddy watch, Theo said happily, splashing in the shallow water. I'm watching, Elliot assured him, though his attention kept drifting to Sienna. She was completely focused on their son singing nonsense songs and making the rubber duck talk in silly voices that made Theo giggle. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with. Playful, nurturing, absolutely present in whatever she was doing. But there was a weariness around her eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. A careful efficiency in her movements that spoke of someone who'd learned to do everything herself. After bath time came the elaborate process of getting Theo into pajamas, brushing his teeth, a negotiation that involved songs about sharks and dancing around the tiny bathroom, and finally settling into his room for the bedtime routine. 3 books maximum, Sienna told Elliot quietly. Otherwise he'll keep requesting more until midnight. The bedtime routine was sacred territory, clearly established through months of consistency. Theo chose his books, settled between his parents on his small bed, and listened with the focused attention that small children reserved for their favorite stories. Brown Bear, Theo requested, handing Elliot the familiar book. As Elliot read, he became aware of Sienna watching them both with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was tenderness there, but also something that might have been grief, as if she was seeing something she'd always hoped for but never quite believed would happen. When the stories were finished, Theo performed his nighttime ritual of kissing his stuffed animals goodnight, adjusting his blanket just so and looking expectantly at his parents. "Sing," he requested. Sienna began a lullaby that Elliot didn't recognize, her voice soft and slightly off-key but infinitely soothing. Theo's eyes grew heavy as she sang, his breathing gradually becoming deeper and more regular. "Sleep tight, little bear," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Daddy, too," Theo mumbled, already half asleep. Elliot leaned down and kissed his son's warm forehead, breathing in that unique scent of clean child and baby shampoo. "Sweet dreams, Theo." They tiptoed out of his room, leaving the door slightly ajar so they could hear him if he needed them. In the small living room, the silence felt both intimate and awkward. "He goes down easy when he's had a full day," Sienna said, settling onto the couch with obvious exhaustion. "That was," Elliot struggled for words, "that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "It's just bedtime," Sienna said, but her voice was soft. "No, it's not. It's everything. It's security and love and consistency, all wrapped up in 30 minutes of stories and songs." Elliot sat beside her on the small couch, careful to maintain some distance. "You've built something incredible for him, Sienna. A real home, a real life. I can see why he's such a happy, confident kid." "Most of the time," Sienna said. "He has his moments like any child. And lately with the move, the new environment," she trailed off, running her hands through her hair. "I worry that I'm not enough, that he needs more stability than I can provide on my own." "You're everything to him," Elliot said firmly. "Anyone can see that. But what happens when he starts asking harder questions about why other kids have fathers who show up to school events? What happens when he wants to play catch or needs help with homework that requires 2 people? What happens when I get sick and there's no backup plan?" The questions hung in the air, each one a small knife to Elliot's conscience. "I want to be that backup plan," Elliot said quietly. "I want to be more than that. I want to be present for the school events and the homework help and the midnight fevers." Sienna studied his face in the dim light from the street outside. "That sounds good in theory, but what about your business? Your travel schedule? Your life in Manhattan that doesn't include midnight diaper changes and toddler meltdowns?" Before Elliot could answer, his phone buzzed with a text message. Then another. Then a series of calls that went to voicemail as he ignored them. "You should probably get that," Sienna said. "It sounds urgent." Elliot glanced at his phone. 17 missed calls from his business partner. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Major client threatening to pull their contract over Elliot's sudden absence. His old life was calling, demanding his attention, reminding him of the empire he'd built and the responsibilities that came with it. "It can wait," he said, turning the phone face down. "Can it?" Sienna asked gently. "Elliot, this is what I'm talking about. Your business doesn't stop because Theo has a fever. Your investors don't care that you want to read bedtime stories. At some point, you're going to have to choose." As if to prove her point, Theo's voice drifted from his bedroom. "Mama, Daddy, monster." They both rushed to his room, where they found him sitting up in bed, pointing at the shadows on his wall cast by streetlight through the train curtains. "No monsters here, buddy," Sienna said soothingly, sitting on his bed. "Just trains on your curtains. Daddy chase monsters," Theo said with absolute confidence, reaching for Elliot. Elliot sat on the other side of the small bed and made an elaborate show of checking under the bed, in the closet, and behind the curtains. "All clear," he announced. No monsters allowed in Theo's room. Stay? Theo asked, looking between his parents. Sienna and Elliot exchanged glances. This was uncharted territory. Both parents present for a nighttime comfort session. Just until you fall back asleep, Sienna agreed. They sat in the dark room, Theo between them until his breathing evened out again. Elliot's phone continued to buzz insistently from the living room, each notification a reminder of the life that was waiting for him, the choices that couldn't be postponed much longer. When they finally returned to the living room, Sienna's expression had changed. She looked resigned, almost sad. You should go, she said quietly. Your business needs you, and we'll be fine. We always are. Elliot looked at the door, then back at the hallway where his son was sleeping peacefully. For the first time in his adult life, he had to choose between professional obligation and personal desire. The choice, when it came, surprised them both. No, he said, picking up his phone and powering it off completely. Whatever it is, they can handle it without me for one night. I'm not leaving. Elliot woke to the sound of tiny feet pattering across hardwood floors, and the whispered urgency of a toddler who had discovered that both his parents were somehow, miraculously, still in his apartment. He'd spent the night on Sienna's small couch, his long frame cramped and uncomfortable, but he'd slept better than he had in months. Mama! Daddy's still here! Theo's voice carried pure joy, as if he'd been given the best Christmas present imaginable. Sienna emerged from her bedroom, hair tousled, wearing an oversized sweater and leggings. She looked surprised to see Elliot folding the blanket she'd given him, as if she'd half expected him to vanish in the night like some fairy tale prince who'd only been playing at being real. Morning, she said quietly, her voice still thick with sleep. Good morning, Elliot replied, then turned to scoop up Theo, who had launched himself toward his father with the fearless enthusiasm only toddlers possessed. How did you sleep, buddy? Good. Daddy stayed. No monsters, Theo declared, wrapping his small arms around Elliot's neck. The simple joy in his son's voice was both heartwarming and devastating. How many mornings had Theo woken up hoping his father would be there? How many times had he been disappointed? Breakfast? Sienna asked, already moving toward the small kitchen with the efficiency of someone whose morning routine had been honed by 20 months of solo parenting. As she prepared Theo's breakfast, cut up bananas, whole grain toast with just a thin layer of jam, and milk in his favorite sippy cup, Elliot's phone began buzzing insistently from where he'd left it on the coffee table. Even powered off the night before, it had apparently turned itself back on, and now it was vibrating with what looked like dozens of messages and missed calls. You should probably check that, Sienna said, not looking up from her careful banana slicing. Elliot glanced at the phone, then at Theo, who was arranging his toy cars in a precise line on the living room floor, while humming tunelessly to himself. Later, Elliot said, but even as he spoke, the phone rang again. This time, Sienna walked over and looked at the caller ID. It's someone named Rebecca. She's called 8 times. Rebecca, his assistant, who only called repeatedly when something catastrophic was happening with the business. Take it, Sienna said gently. Theo and I have a morning routine anyway. He likes to help me make coffee. With reluctance, Elliot answered the phone. Rebecca's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Mr. Van Doren, thank God. Where are you? The board is in crisis mode. The Yamamoto deal is falling apart because you missed yesterday's conference call with Tokyo. Marcus has been fielding calls all night, but they want to speak directly with you and… Rebecca, slow down. Elliot watched Theo carefully placing coffee filters in the machine under Sienna's patient guidance. What exactly has happened? Yamamoto Industries is threatening to pull their contract. It's worth $47 million, and they're saying if you can't commit to being present for negotiations, they'll take their business to Henderson Corp. The board called an emergency meeting for this morning, and Marcus is talking about calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership. Elliot felt his stomach drop. The Yamamoto deal had been in negotiation for 8 months. It wasn't just about the money. It was about establishing Van Doren Logistics as a major player in the Asian market. Can we reschedule the Tokyo call? He asked, though he already knew the answer. They're in final negotiations with 3 companies. If we don't respond today, they're moving forward with someone else. Rebecca's voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Sir, I know you said to cancel everything, but this could seriously damage the company. Your company. Elliot closed his eyes. The empire he'd spent 15 years building was crumbling because he'd chosen to stay overnight in a cramped Queens apartment to make sure his son felt safe after a nightmare. When is the board meeting? He asked. 9 a.m. It's 7:30 now. If you leave immediately, you could make it. From the kitchen, he heard Theo's delighted laughter as he helped measure coffee grounds, most of which were ending up on the floor. Sienna was patiently cleaning up the mess while maintaining an animated conversation about the proper coffee-to-water ratio, with someone who was far more interested in the mechanical process than the actual beverage. Mr. Van Doren? Rebecca's voice was urgent. I'll call you back in 10 minutes, Elliot said, hanging up before she could respond. Sienna had clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. Her face was carefully neutral, but Elliot could see the resignation in her eyes, the look of someone who had expected this moment and prepared herself for it. Big meeting? She asked lightly, lifting Theo onto the counter so he could pour water into the coffee maker. Potentially company-ending meeting, Elliot admitted. Theo, oblivious to the tension, was narrating his coffee-making process. Water goes whoosh, coffee goes bubble bubble, Mama drinks coffee, gets happy. Coffee does make Mama happy, Sienna agreed, kissing the top of his head. And Daddy probably needs coffee for his important work meeting. There it was, the graceful exit she was offering him. No guilt, no demands, no tears. Just the practical acknowledgement that his real life was calling and he needed to go answer it. Sienna, it's okay, Elliot. I understand. This is why I never wanted to depend on anyone else being here. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that sounded like old pain being carefully managed. Theo and I have our routine. We'll be fine, will you? Elliot asked quietly. Be fine, I mean. Not just today, but will you be fine if I keep choosing work over this? Sienna was quiet for a long moment, helping Theo down from the counter and settling him at his high chair with his breakfast. Do you remember our last fight? She asked suddenly. The real one, not the polite conversation we had when you left. The fight where I said things I probably shouldn't have said. Elliot remembered. It had been 3 days before he'd walked out. They'd been discussing nursery colors of all things, and somehow it had devolved into a screaming match about commitment and priorities, and whether Elliot would ever be capable of putting anyone else's needs before his own. You said I was already married, he said quietly, to my work, that there wasn't room for anyone else in that relationship. I was right, wasn't I? Sienna's voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. You're a good man, Elliot. You're kind and generous, and you love Theo. I can see that. But loving someone and being present for them are different things. Theo, happily munching his banana slices, reached over and patted Elliot's hand. Daddy sad? He asked with the intuitive emotional intelligence that small children sometimes possessed. No, buddy. Daddy's just thinking. But Theo wasn't fooled. He climbed out of his high chair and onto Elliot's lap, wrapping his small arms around his father's neck in a gesture of pure, unconditional comfort. Better now? Theo asked, patting Elliot's cheek with a slightly sticky hand. The gesture broke something inside Elliot's chest. This child, his child, was offering comfort to a father who had spent 20 months proving he didn't deserve it. Yeah, Elliot whispered, his voice rough. Much better now. His phone rang again. Rebecca, no doubt, with another update about the crisis that was apparently unfolding in Manhattan, while he sat in a queen's kitchen being consoled by a toddler who barely knew him. I have to make a choice, Elliot said, more to himself than to Sienna. You've already made it, she replied softly. Several times, actually. The question is whether you're going to keep making the same choice or if you're ready to choose differently. Elliot looked at his phone, then at Theo, who was now trying to feed him banana slices with generous toddler determination. The choice, when it came, felt both terrifying and inevitable. He picked up his phone and dialed. Rebecca answered on the first ring. Rebecca, I need you to conference me into the board meeting from here. And get Marcus on the line. We need to restructure how we handle the Asian accounts. He paused, watching Theo's face light up at the word banana in 3 different silly voices. I won't be coming into the office today, or tomorrow, and we need to talk about adjusting my travel schedule permanently. There was silence on the other end of the line. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. I'm learning to be a father, Rebecca. That means my priorities are changing and the company needs to adapt accordingly. As he spoke, he realized Sienna was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but something else too. Something that might have been hope. The conference call with the board was unlike any business meeting Elliot had ever conducted. He sat at Sienna's small kitchen table with his laptop, trying to negotiate a $47 million deal while Theo played quietly at his feet, occasionally offering him toy cars and whispering, "Daddy working," with the reverent tone children reserved for adult mysteries they didn't quite understand. Mr. Van Doren, with all due respect, Yamamoto Industries expects a certain level of availability from their partners. Marcus Brennan's voice crackled through the laptop speakers, barely concealed frustration evident even through the poor connection. Your recent absence has raised concerns about your commitment to this partnership. Elliot watched Theo carefully park his toy bus next to his father's foot, then look up with a smile that could have powered the entire Queensboro. Mr. Brennan, I understand their concerns, Elliot said, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of conducting international business negotiations while his 20-month-old son played truck driver around his ankles. But I'm proposing we restructure our approach to better serve their long-term needs. For the next hour, Elliot orchestrated what amounted to a complete reorganization of his company's management structure. He promoted Rebecca to vice president of operations, gave Marcus full authority over international negotiations, and established a system where he could maintain strategic oversight without the grinding daily travel that had defined his previous life. You're essentially stepping back from day-to-day operations, board member Patricia Holbrook observed, her tone carefully neutral. Are we to understand this as a permanent change? Elliot glanced at Sienna, who was making lunch for Theo while trying to pretend she wasn't listening to every word of the conversation. She'd been carefully quiet throughout the call, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the knife a little too tightly while cutting sandwiches. This is about building a sustainable business model that doesn't require the CEO to be available 24 hours a day, Elliot said. Companies that depend on one person's constant presence aren't really companies. They're extended consulting practices. It was a good answer. It was also a complete reversal of everything he'd believed about leadership for the past 15 years. The call ended with grudging agreement from the board and a rescheduled video conference with Yamamoto for later that week, one that Marcus would conduct with Elliot participating remotely. It wasn't perfect, but it was workable. When Elliot closed the laptop, the apartment felt strangely quiet. Theo had fallen asleep on the living room floor, surrounded by his cars, one small hand still clutching his stuffed elephant. That sounded like a major restructuring, Sienna said carefully, not quite meeting his eyes. It was. Elliot stood up, his back aching from the small kitchen chair. I just delegated away about 70% of my previous responsibilities. Are you sure that's what you want? There was something in her voice. Not quite skepticism, but a wariness that spoke of someone who'd been disappointed before. Elliot was quiet for a moment, studying her face. What aren't you saying, Sienna? She was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. 2 years ago you told me you weren't ready to be a father because you were afraid you'd be like your dad. Absent, emotionally unavailable. Then you walked away and proved your own point. She set down the knife and turned to face him fully. Now you're telling me you're ready to restructure your entire life, but how do I know this isn't just another version of running away? I'm not following. Elliot, you've built an empire. You're successful, respected, wealthy beyond most people's dreams. And in one morning, because of one night with your sick son, you're ready to throw it all away? Sienna's voice was getting stronger, more direct. That doesn't sound like commitment to me. That sounds like guilt-driven overcorrection. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. You think I'm being impulsive. I think you're being reactive. There's a difference between changing your priorities and abandoning them entirely. She moved closer, her eyes searching his face. What happens in 6 months when the novelty wears off and you realize you miss the thrill of closing major deals? What happens when staying home for bedtime stories starts to feel suffocating instead of meaningful? Elliot felt his chest tighten. I would never. You already did, Elliot. You already walked away once when things got complicated. Sienna's voice was gentle, but the words were devastating. How do I trust that this time is different? From the living room, Theo stirred in his sleep, making soft whimpering sounds that indicated he might be waking from his nap. Because this time I know what I'm walking away from, Elliot said quietly. 2 years ago I was afraid of becoming a bad father, so I chose to be no father at all. I convinced myself that was the noble choice. He gestured toward the sleeping child. Now I've seen what I lost. I've held my son, read him stories, watched him trust me even though I haven't earned it. I know what love looks like now, and I know what it costs. Sienna's expression softened slightly, but her posture remained guarded. Love isn't just a feeling, Elliot. It's a daily choice. It's staying when you're tired, showing up when it's inconvenient, putting someone else's needs before your own, even when no one's watching. She paused, glancing at Theo. I've been making that choice every day for 20 months, can you? Before Elliot could answer, Theo woke up and immediately started crying, not the gentle fussing of a child who needed comfort, but the full-throated wailing of someone who was genuinely distressed. He's still recovering from being sick, Sienna explained, immediately moving to comfort him. His sleep schedule is off and he gets overwhelmed easily. Nothing they tried seemed to help. Theo pushed away from Sienna, arched his back away from Elliot, and continued crying with the relentless intensity that only toddlers could sustain. His face was red, his breathing rapid, and the sound was filling the small apartment with a stress that seemed to multiply exponentially in the confined space. Sometimes he gets like this, Sienna said, her voice tight with worry and exhaustion. Overstimulated, overtired, nothing helps except time and patience. 15 minutes of crying turned into 30. Theo refused food, rejected comfort, and seemed inconsolable. The neighbors upstairs started banging on the floor, whether in sympathy or irritation was unclear. Maybe we should call the doctor, Elliot suggested, feeling helpless in the face of his son's distress. He's fine physically, Sienna said, though she looked anything but certain. This is what parenting actually looks like sometimes. It's not reading bedtime stories and morning coffee routines, it's this. Crying you can't stop, problems you can't solve, hours where nothing you do seems to help. She was testing him, Elliot realized. Not consciously, perhaps, but this was the reality check she'd been afraid to voice directly. This was what commitment looked like when it wasn't heartwarming or Instagram-worthy. As if to emphasize the point, Theo threw up on himself, which led to an even more intense round of crying while Sienna cleaned him up with practiced efficiency, and Elliot felt completely useless. I don't know how to help, Elliot said, his voice strained. Welcome to parenting, Sienna replied, not unkindly. Most of the time you don't know how to help. You just keep trying different things until something works, or until they exhaust themselves, or until you accept that sometimes there's no immediate solution. Elliot sat on the floor next to the couch where Sienna was holding Theo, who had finally reduced his crying to hiccuping sobs. Without thinking, Elliot began humming, a tuneless melody his own mother had hummed when he was small and couldn't sleep. Gradually, Theo's sobs quieted. He turned his tear-streaked face toward Elliot, listening to the soft humming with the intense focus that exhausted children sometimes displayed. Keep going, Sienna whispered. Elliot continued humming, adding gentle words he half remembered. Hush now, little bear. Daddy's here, Mama's here, everything's safe. Theo reached one small hand toward Elliot, who took it gently in his own. The child's breathing gradually steadied, his body relaxing against Sienna's chest. Better now? Elliot asked softly. Theo nodded, then surprised them both by reaching for his father. As Elliot gathered his son into his arms, Theo whispered something that made Sienna's eyes fill with tears. Love, Daddy. Stay, Daddy. In that moment, sitting on the floor of a cramped apartment with his exhausted ex-girlfriend and his overtired son, Elliot understood something fundamental about love. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up for the crying fits, the sleepless nights, the ordinary Tuesday afternoons when nothing went according to plan. I'm staying, he whispered back, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Theo or to Sienna. I'm not going anywhere. As he spoke the words, he realized they weren't just a promise. They were the truest thing he'd ever said. 3 weeks later, Elliot's new life had settled into a rhythm he never could have imagined. He'd moved into a hotel in Queens, not because Sienna had asked him to stay close, but because the 40-minute commute to Manhattan felt like crossing continents when Theo had a fever or Sienna needed backup during a work crisis. The business was surviving his reduced involvement. Marcus had proven surprisingly capable of handling international negotiations, and Rebecca had transformed from assistant to strategic partner with an efficiency that made Elliot realize he'd been micromanaging his own company for years. The Yamamoto deal had closed successfully, with a bonus clause that actually exceeded the original proposal. But none of that seemed to matter as much as the text message that had arrived at 6 that morning. Theo's fever is back, 102.5, heading to ER. Now sitting in the same emergency department where this had all begun, Elliot felt the familiar knot of helplessness in his chest. But this time was different. This time he wasn't a stranger fumbling through an unfamiliar crisis. He was a father who knew his son's favorite comfort toy, the elephant, his preferred position for being held when sick, upright, head on left shoulder, and exactly how to distract him during medical procedures. by making silly faces and humming that tuneless lullaby. His oxygen levels look good, Dr. Martinez assured them, reviewing Theo's chart. This appears to be a different virus, probably something he picked up at daycare. Kids his age can get sick frequently as their immune systems develop. But he was fine yesterday, Sienna said, the exhaustion in her voice betraying 3 weeks of single parenting punctuated by Elliot's helpful, but still sporadic presence. Viral illnesses can spike quickly in toddlers, Dr. Martinez explained kindly. The good news is he's staying well hydrated and his fever is responding to medication. I'd like to keep him for observation for a few hours, but this should resolve much more quickly than his previous illness. As the doctor left, Sienna slumped in her chair with the particular weariness of someone who'd been operating on crisis mode for too long. I can't keep doing this, she said quietly, not looking at Elliot. Doing what? This in-between thing we're doing. You showing up when there's an emergency, then going back to your hotel, then showing up again when I text you. It's confusing for Theo and it's... She trailed off, running her hands through her hair. It's what? It's breaking my heart, she said simply. Every time you leave, he asks when Daddy's coming back. Every time you show up, I remember what it felt like when we were a family. And I can't keep hoping for something that might not be real. Elliot felt his chest tighten. 3 weeks of bedtime stories and breakfast routines had shown him everything he'd lost, but he was still living in the margins of their lives, helpful when needed, absent when not. What do you want me to do? He asked. Before Sienna could answer, Theo stirred in the hospital bed, opening fever-bright eyes and immediately reaching for both of them. Mama, Daddy, both here, he said with satisfaction, as if he'd solved a complex puzzle. Both here, Sienna agreed softly, her voice catching. Story? Theo requested hopefully. They'd read him 3 books already, but Elliot reached for the small stack they'd brought from home. As he opened the familiar brown bear book, Theo settled between his parents with the contentment of a child who had everything he needed within arm's reach. Brown bear, what do you see? Elliot read, but his mind was racing beyond the simple text. What did he see? He saw Sienna's hand unconsciously stroking Theo's hair as he listened to the story. He saw the way their son's breathing gradually became more even as the fever medication took effect. He saw the life he'd walked away from and the life he could still choose to embrace. I see a red bird looking at me, he continued, but what he really saw was the truth he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. When the story ended, Theo had fallen asleep again, but his small hands were holding on to both his parents, one finger wrapped around Sienna's thumb, the other clutching Elliot's sleeve. He doesn't want either of us to leave, Elliot observed quietly. He's learning not to trust that people will stay, Sienna said, and the quiet accusation in her words was unmistakable. Sienna. Elliot's voice was rough. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know that showing up 3 weeks ago doesn't erase 20 months of absence, but I also know that I can't keep living in hotel rooms, pretending that visiting my son is the same as raising him. She looked at him carefully as if trying to decide whether his words were genuine or just another beautifully constructed business pitch. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to come home, not to some fantasy version of our life where everything is perfect, but to the real thing. The 2 a.m. fevers and the grocery store meltdowns and the tiny apartment where there's no space for anyone to hide from their feelings. Elliot, I know you're scared to trust me again. I'm scared too. I'm scared I'll disappoint you both. Scared I'll never be the father Theo deserves. Scared I'll mess this up in ways I can't even imagine yet. He looked down at their sleeping son. But I'm more scared of missing the rest of his childhood because I was too much of a coward to try. Sienna was quiet for a long time, watching Theo's peaceful face. What about your company? Your life in Manhattan? My company will adapt. It already has. And my life in Manhattan was just existing. This is living. A nurse peeked in to check Theo's vitals, and the interruption gave Sienna time to compose herself. When they were alone again, her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. If you come home, it has to be real. Not a trial period, not an experiment, not something you can walk away from when it gets hard. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. It has to be forever. Forever is a long time to promise, Elliot said quietly. It's exactly the right amount of time to promise when you're talking about being someone's father. Elliot looked at Theo, then at Sienna, then out the window at the Queen's skyline where somewhere there was a small apartment with train curtains and not enough closet space and the most important family he'd ever been part of. Then that's what I'm promising, he said. Forever. Sienna studied his face for what felt like an eternity. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Okay. Come home, Elliot. Come home and let's figure out how to be a family. As if he'd been waiting for those exact words, Theo opened his eyes and smiled at both of them with the pure joy of a child whose world had just become complete. Home, he repeated happily. Altogether home. For the first time in 2 years, Elliot believed that home was exactly where he belonged. 6 months later, the new apartment in Park Slope was everything the Queen's Place hadn't been. Spacious, bright, with enough room for Theo to run his toy cars without crashing into furniture every few seconds. But what made it special wasn't the extra square footage or the working elevator, or even the small backyard where Theo could play safely. What made it special was the sound that filled it every morning, the laughter of a family who had learned to choose each other, again and again, through sleepless nights and minor emergencies, and the 1,000 ordinary moments that made up a life together. Elliot stood in the kitchen attempting to flip pancakes while Theo helped, by standing on a step stool and providing commentary on proper pancake flipping technique. "Daddy, too fast, pancake flying," Theo announced with delight as Elliot's ambitious flip sent batter splattering across the stovetop. "Your son has strong opinions about pancake aerodynamics," Sienna observed from the breakfast table, where she was reviewing client proposals on her laptop. Her consulting business had grown significantly since she'd been able to establish a proper home office, and she'd recently hired 2 part-time employees to help manage the expanding workload. "Our son," Elliot corrected automatically, the possessive pronoun still sending a warm thrill through him even after months of daily practice. "And he gets his perfectionist tendencies from his mother." "I am not a perfectionist," Sienna protested, then immediately reached over to straighten a stack of napkins that was already perfectly aligned. Theo giggled at his parents' familiar banter, then climbed down from his step stool to retrieve his stuffed elephant from under the table. At 2 years and 2 months old, he was talking in full sentences, had strong opinions about everything from breakfast foods to bedtime stories, and possessed an uncanny ability to sense when his parents needed a hug. "Mama working?" he asked, observing Sienna's focused attention on her laptop screen. "Mama's working for 30 more minutes, then we're all going to the park," she explained, closing the laptop to give him her full attention. "Daddy's going to push you on the swings while Mama sits on the bench and pretends she's not terrified you're going to launch yourself into orbit." "I like swings," Theo declared, then paused thoughtfully. "What's orbit?" "It's where rockets go," Elliot explained, setting a plate of marginally successful pancakes in front of his son, very far away from Mama's and Daddy's. "No orbit," Theo said decisively. "Stay with Mama and Daddy." "That's the plan, buddy," Elliot said, ruffling his son's dark hair. As they settled into breakfast, Elliot reflected on how dramatically his definition of success had changed. 6 months ago, success had meant closed deals, profit margins, and market dominance. Now it meant Theo eating most of his pancakes without dropping them on the floor, Sienna laughing at his terrible dad jokes, and the 3 of them making it through an entire day without any major meltdowns, though the jury was still out on whether that last metric applied to Theo or to his parents. The business was thriving under its new structure. Marcus had proven to be an exceptional leader for international operations. Rebecca had been promoted to Chief Operations Officer, and Elliot had discovered that strategic oversight was both more challenging and more rewarding than the tactical firefighting that had consumed his previous life. He traveled occasionally, usually day trips, sometimes overnight, but never without extensive planning, and always with a clear return date that Theo could mark on his calendar with dinosaur stickers. "Speaking of the park," Sienna said, "did you remember that Sarah and her kids are meeting us there? Theo's been asking about playing with Emma all week." Elliot nodded, though he still felt a small flutter of anxiety about social situations with other parents. He'd missed 2 years of the subtle cultural education that came with playground politics, and he sometimes felt like he was learning a foreign language when other fathers discussed topics like preschool applications and pediatric dentist recommendations. "Will Emma's daddy be there?" Theo asked hopefully. Emma's father, David, had become something of a hero in Theo's eyes because he could whistle loudly enough to call children from across the entire playground. "I think so," Sienna said. "But remember, even if he's not there, you'll still have fun playing with Emma and her mom." It was a gentle reminder of the reality they'd all had to adjust to. Families came in different configurations, and presence wasn't always guaranteed. Theo had adapted to this concept with the resilience that seemed to be his particular superpower, but Sienna and Elliot remained vigilant about reinforcing his security whenever possible. "I want to show Emma my new truck," Theo announced, already planning his afternoon social agenda. "That sounds like an excellent plan," Elliot agreed, clearing the breakfast dishes while Theo ran to his room to select the optimal trucks for playground sharing. In the brief moment of quiet, Sienna moved closer to Elliot, slipping her arms around his waist from behind as he loaded the dishwasher. "Happy?" she asked softly, a question that had become part of their daily ritual. "Completely," Elliot replied, turning in her arms to face her. "Even when I'm terrible at pancakes and have no idea what I'm doing half the time." "Especially then," Sienna said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Perfect fathers exist only in fairy tales. Real fathers learn as they go, make mistakes, and love their children enough to keep trying to do better." "Ready for park," Theo announced, reappearing with his arms full of trucks and his elephant tucked under one arm. "Go now?" "Go now," Sienna confirmed, grabbing her purse and the diaper bag that, despite Theo's increasing independence, still seemed to require approximately 47 emergency items for any excursion longer than 30 minutes. As they walked the 6 blocks to the park, Theo chattering excitedly about swings and slides and the possibility of seeing dogs, Elliot found himself thinking about the phone call that had changed everything. The scared voice of a nurse asking if he knew Sienna Clark. The choice between a luxury vacation and a sick child who needed his father. If someone had told him 6 months ago that he would gladly trade his Manhattan penthouse for a Saturday morning spent pushing swings and wiping sticky hands, he would have questioned their sanity. Now watching Theo run toward the playground with unbridled joy while Sienna took his hand, with the casual intimacy of someone who trusted him to stay, Elliot understood that the best decisions were often the ones that looked like mistakes from the outside. "Daddy, watch," Theo called from the top of the slide, waving enthusiastically. "I'm watching," Elliot called back, and realized that those words had become the most important promise he'd ever made. Not just to watch this moment, but to be present for all the moments that would follow. The scraped knees and hurt feelings, the bedtime stories and Christmas mornings, the ordinary Tuesday afternoons that would, collectively, make up his son's childhood. As Theo launched himself down the slide with gleeful abandon, landing safely in the sand and immediately scrambling back toward the ladder for another turn, Elliot felt a profound sense of gratitude for the crisis that had forced him to confront his own cowardice. Some gifts came disguised as emergencies. Some of the most important decisions happened in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. And sometimes the call you almost didn't answer turned out to be an invitation to the life you never knew you wanted. "Daddy, again!" Theo shouted, already halfway back up the ladder. "Again," Elliot agreed, settling onto the park bench next to Sienna to watch their son play, marveling at how a word as simple as "again" could contain so much promise. The end. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. When faced with a choice between career success and family responsibility, would you have made the same decision Elliot did? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.